Hello everyone and welcome to this week's YouTube video for week 10 for Programming 2. So the lab presents this week a review of some of the concepts we've studied in Programming 2, including basic class design, comparing objects in enumerated types, exception classes, and interfaces. So getting started this week is a little bit different. What you should do is download some starter code from this week's lab from AUT online. Just go under week 10 and it's right next to the lab paper that you can also download, this one here. And basically we have many different questions and some starting code to help you answer those questions. And in particular today we're going to look at the last question on array lists. We're going to complete the array list pairs class by completing the switch pairs method, which takes as input an array list of strings and switches each pair of elements. So we're going to print the array, which prints to be or not to be as separate strings, switch the pairs, and then print it again, should print B2 not or B2. And of course, if it contains an odd number of elements, then the last element's position is unmodified. So how do we do this? Well, downloading the starting code, we have array list pairs in question 5, which is already kind of started for us. It doesn't do much other than try to print the array and then switch the pairs and print it again. But you have to implement this functionality for it to work. So let's try by starting to print the array list. How do we do that? Well, if you're want to try something different than a regular for loop, then you can use an enhanced for loop. For string s in string list, and then we do something with it. What could we do? System.out.println. Well, just printing, in fact. Maybe adding a nice space in the middle so it looks good whenever we print it. And what next? Maybe adding an end of line character at the end, like so. So that's pretty easy. So whenever we print this out, we should get something like this. To be or not to be, and then switch pairs doesn't do anything yet, and then print array list prints out the identical list. So let's get working on switching the pairs around. So how do we do that? Well, we go up here, and the first thing we need to do really is iterate through the loop, iterate through the array list. So that's quite straightforward, and we're going to use a standard for loop to do this. For int I is equal to 0, I is less than what? The string list dot size, and then we're going to go I++. Now, something that we could note here is that maybe we want to print out each string as we get it. So how do we get a string from the array list? We use string list.get, and then we give it an I. So that gets the ith element out of the list, and maybe we want to print that out like so. And we can set a breakpoint here so that whenever we run this code, it stops. So we already printed it out, and then this is going to effectively print it out again. To be or not to be. Then it completes it, prints it out again at the bottom. So what we actually really want is to print each pair of items, or each pair of elements. So we want to look at each pair and swap them, don't we? So we want something that looks like this. We want to input this to be or not to be, and we want to swap them so that we get something that looks like this, B2 not or B2, like that. How do we do that? Well, it's important to note that maybe what we could do as an algorithm is look at every pair. So this would be a pair here, this is a pair here, and this is a pair here of strings. And starting with 0, so starting with this 0th string, we swap it with the first string, and starting with the second string here, we swap it with the third here, and the fourth is swapped with the fifth. All right, so let's try that out. Let's say if we just go back up here and try this. How do we access every even element in the array? It's quite easy. Instead of doing plus plus, you know that plus I plus plus is equivalent to saying I plus equals 1, in the sense that it adds 1 to I. But what we'd really like to do is add 2 every time, so that whenever we execute this, then we've got printing out 2 or 2, and that's it. So in fact, it prints out even numbered elements in this array list. So we used get I here. Now all we need to do is set this one to be that value. So that's quite easy. All we need to do is write string list dot set. Now look at it, keeps the index. You replace the ith element in the array list with this element. So we set and we give it an I, and we give it a what? The next one, string list dot get I plus 1. So when I is 0, then it swaps it with the first element, and if I is 2, then it swaps it with the third element. But of course, lastly, we want to set the value for I plus 1. And we set it to this original value t. So we swap it out and store it in this string t, do a switch, and then put it back. So let's run this. Now there's going to be a slight error, but let's see if you can spot it. So let's look at the string list. So you'll notice the change here, and we change it again. So we've got the first pair done. That looks good. We've got the second pair done. That looks good. We've got the last pair done, and then we're done. And we get the output that we expected. So no problems, right? Well, what happens if we add another string? Let's find out. I think you already know what happens. So we swap each pair of elements, but then we encounter a bit of a problem. We're at element 6, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we're trying to access the 7th value in this array. So something quite bad will happen. We get an index out of bounds exception. So we don't want that. We don't want to try to catch these sorts of things. So what do? Well, we have to set up a check for it. So all we need to do is make sure that if I plus 1 is less than string length dot size, then we're all right. We can do all of this swapping. That is to say, it's not the last element in an odd array. So we could do it like that. And when we run that, we get the expected output. To be or not to be, and then another is added at the end. And these are all swapped. And of course, the last odd element in the array is left as is. So as requested, we can get that, remove that as well. Run it again. All right, so that concludes this week's YouTube video. I hope you found it useful, and we'll see you in the lab. Welcome back to this week's YouTube video for week 10. So I just completed the switch pairs assignment in the lab, and I hope some of you have noticed that this solution given wasn't quite as elegant as one would hope. So how would we improve this situation? How would we get rid of this if I plus 1 is less than string list size and not have it crash like it did the last time? So if we remove this, and if we run this with to be or not to be and another string, then we get it to index out of bounds exception. So the solution was, well, we should check to make sure that I plus 1 is less than string list dot size. So that makes sense. But it's rather cumbersome and really not that helpful. What you should do instead is the following. Why not just say dot size minus 1? Does that work? Let's find out. Oh. To be or not to be and another. B2 or not B2, another. That seems quite reasonable, but I'm not going all the way to the end of the array. So maybe if I have an even numbered array, it won't work. But of course it does. To be or not to be, B2 not or B2. So the moral of the story is to be careful about what you're writing in your Java classes to make sure that they are the clearest code that you can possibly write so that other people, when they read it, can understand it. So really, instead of having an extra if statement there, we could of course just not iterate to the end of the array. So we add a -1. Thanks again for listening. See you in the labs.